She still doesn't know about Camille, Willis. Not the case, not the money, none of it. I can't tell her until I know for sure what happened.
I heard everything, Marcus. Who is Camille?
3 days earlier, Denise Carter had no idea that name existed at all. She had been married to Marcus for 19 years, and in all that time she had never once opened his laptop without asking. They'd built a good life in Sacramento together, the kind of life people at church called blessed, without meaning it as a throwaway word. Marcus ran Carter Construction, 40 employees on payroll, a name on half the new builds going up on the east side of town. Denise taught 8th grade math at the same middle school for 16 years. They had one daughter, 17, a junior in high school, and a marriage that had weathered enough ordinary storms that Denise had stopped expecting the extraordinary kind. That changed on a Tuesday evening in March. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, back to the story. She needed to print a boarding pass for her mother's flight and found Marcus's laptop already logged in on the kitchen counter, left open in the rush of a normal weeknight. What she saw on the screen was not a boarding pass. It was a travel itinerary, 2 names, 1 destination, and a date circled in a way that told her this trip had been planned for months. She scrolled down, expecting a surprise she'd later pretend not to know about. Instead, she found a folder labeled with a name that wasn't hers. A woman's name, Camille. She closed the laptop slowly, the way a man closes a door when he doesn't want anyone else in the house to hear it click. Except this time it was Denise doing the closing, and the house was silent enough that she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Marcus had mentioned their 20th anniversary only in passing that week, joking that they should keep it small, maybe dinner at the restaurant from their first date. But the itinerary on his screen wasn't small. It was 4 nights at a lodge on the Mendocino coast, ocean view suite, private chef on request, the kind of trip a man plans when he's trying to make up for something. Denise had never been to that coastline. She was fairly certain Marcus hadn't either. Carter Construction kept him busy enough that vacations were usually a long weekend at a lake, not a coastal retreat booked 6 months out, with a level of research that looked less like a surprise and more like a man returning to a place he already knew intimately. That night she lay next to her husband, listening to him breathe, the same steady rhythm she'd fallen asleep to for 2 decades, telling herself there was an explanation that didn't involve another woman. Maybe Camille was a travel coordinator. Maybe it was a business contact whose name got tangled into a shared folder by accident. Marcus ran a company with 40 employees on payroll. There were 100 women whose names could land in his files for reasons that meant nothing at all. She almost searched the name that night, phone in hand under the covers, and then talked herself out of it, telling herself that whatever she found couldn't be undone once she'd seen it. Some questions, she knew, you only get to ask once before the answer changes everything that comes after. She didn't say a word to him the next morning. Instead, she watched. She noticed the calls he'd started taking in the garage now, door shut, voice low enough that she could never catch more than a sentence at a time. She noticed a recurring charge on their joint statement, small enough she'd never questioned it before, from a private investigator's office 2 towns over, going back 8 months. She noticed that when their daughter mentioned the anniversary trip at dinner, excited for her parents, Marcus's smile arrived a half-second too late, like a man building an expression from scratch instead of feeling it. 20 years of marriage teaches you to read a face faster than words, and every read she was getting now came back wrong. She started paying closer attention to the small things a wife usually lets pass without notice. His phone, always face down now, had never been face down before. He'd started leaving for the job site 20 minutes earlier than usual and coming home later, and when she asked him about a specific project he mentioned, the details didn't quite line up with what his foreman told her at a company barbecue the following weekend. She wasn't naturally the suspicious type. 16 years of teaching 8th graders had taught her to read a lie from across a classroom. The way a kid's eyes drift up and to the left when they're building a story instead of remembering one. And she was starting to see that same drift in her husband's eyes every time the subject of the trip came up. If you were sitting across that dinner table watching your husband's smile arrive a half-second too late, would you have said something right there, or would you have waited, the way Denise did, to be sure you weren't about to accuse an innocent man of something unforgivable? Drop your answer in the comments, because what Denise heard 2 nights later would end the waiting for good. She'd gone upstairs early with a headache, the bedroom extension still in her hand from a call with her sister, when she heard the line click open again downstairs. Marcus's voice, low, coming from the garage, talking to someone named Willis about a case, about money, about a name he still hadn't said out loud to his own wife. She stood frozen in the dark hallway and listened to her husband tell a stranger that she still didn't know about Camille, not the case, not the money, none of it, that he couldn't tell her until he knew for sure what happened. Denise didn't hang up quietly the way she should have. She walked straight down those stairs with the phone still in her hand and asked him the only question that mattered. "Who is Camille?" Marcus's face went the color of old drywall. He didn't lie to her, not that night and not once in the conversation that followed. But he also didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Not until she pushed harder than she'd ever pushed him on anything in 19 years of marriage. What he gave her that night was a last name to go with the first, Camille Michaels, and an address for a man named Willis, 2 towns over, who could tell her the rest. Because Marcus, even cornered, still couldn't bring himself to say all of it out loud. He asked her for one thing before she left the room: time. Just enough time to finish what he'd started before he had to explain why he'd started it at all. The moment he left the room, Denise searched the name for herself, and the second result stopped her cold. It was a local news archive, 5 years old. Missing, Mendocino County woman, last seen near Coastal Trail. The photo showed a woman in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back, standing near a lighthouse Denise didn't recognize. Camille Michaels had gone hiking alone on a Thursday afternoon and never made it back to her car. Search crews combed the trails for 2 weeks. No body was ever recovered. The case went cold within a year. One more name folded into a list of people who simply stopped existing without an explanation anyone could give their families. Denise read the article 3 times, and each time her eyes landed on the same detail: October the 14th. The exact date circled in red on her husband's itinerary, 5 years later, at the same stretch of coastline. She barely slept that night, and by morning she'd made a decision Marcus wouldn't find out about for another 4 days. She wasn't going to wait for him to explain things on his own timeline. She was going to find out the truth herself, starting with the one name he'd actually given her. She drove to the investigator's office the following morning, a small storefront wedged between a dry cleaner and a check cashing place, and told the receptionist she was Marcus Carter's wife. The man who came out, a retired county detective named Willis, studied her for a long moment before asking her to sit. He told her Marcus had hired him 8 months earlier to quietly reopen the Camille Michaels case, using resources and contacts the original investigation never had. Denise asked why her husband would spend a small fortune investigating a woman's disappearance he had no connection to. Willis's answer came slow and careful, the way a man talks when he knows the next sentence is going to change someone's life. He told her that wasn't entirely true. Willis laid it out plainly. 5 years earlier, Camille Michaels had worked as a site coordinator for Carter Construction, and she'd spent over a year in a relationship with Marcus's business partner, a man named Theo Bragg, who was married at the time. The affair was kept quiet, known to only a handful of people at the company, Marcus among them. 2 weeks before Camille vanished, she told Marcus she was done keeping the secret and planned to tell Bragg's wife everything. Marcus never got the chance to warn her against it, because within days Camille was gone, and Bragg had an alibi that Marcus himself had unknowingly helped provide by confirming they'd spent the entire afternoon together reviewing site permits. Denise sat in that office feeling the ground shift under a marriage she thought she understood completely. Her husband hadn't been hiding a mistress. He'd been carrying a 5-year suspicion about his own best friend and business partner, a man who'd stood up as best man at their wedding, a man who now ran half the company Marcus had built from nothing with his own hands. Willis explained that Marcus never took his suspicions to police because he had no proof, only a timeline that never sat right and a memory of Bragg's alibi that felt, even years later, too convenient to be accidental. The anniversary trip wasn't a getaway. It was Marcus retracing Camille's last known steps under the cover of a romantic milestone, so no one, including his own wife, would ask why he was really going back to that coastline. Willis wasn't finished. He pulled a thin folder from a locked drawer and slid it across the desk, careful the way a man is careful with something he's not entirely authorized to show her. Inside were copies of Camille's final phone records, obtained through channels Willis didn't explain in detail. In the 2 weeks before she disappeared, her most frequent contact wasn't Bragg at all. It was a number registered to a man named Curtis Holloway, another site foreman who'd worked under Bragg at the time, and had since left the company under circumstances nobody at Carter Construction liked to discuss. Willis admitted he'd spent nearly 3 months chasing Holloway as the more likely suspect, tracking him to a job in Reno, before the timeline fell apart. Holloway had been on a documented flight to Arizona the day Camille vanished, an alibi that actually held up. It was a dead end, but it was the kind of dead end that had cost Marcus 5 months and a real chunk of his savings before Willis's attention swung back to Bragg. Denise left that office with her head spinning, no longer certain who to be afraid of, and no longer sure the truth was as simple as one guilty man and one innocent one. If Willis himself, a trained detective, had chased the wrong man for 3 months, what confidence did they really have that Bragg was the right one now? 3 nights later, driving home from her sister's place after dark, Denise noticed a pair of headlights holding steady 2 car lengths back for 11 miles straight, matching every turn she made, dropping off only when she pulled into her own driveway with the porch light already on. She told herself it was nothing. She didn't fully believe it. The following week, her phone rang from a blocked number while she was alone in the kitchen. A man's voice, flat and unhurried, told her to remind her husband that some things are better left buried on a hillside, and hung up before she could get a word out. She didn't tell Marcus that night. She sat with it, turning the voice over in her mind, wondering if it belonged to a man she'd shaken hands with at a company Christmas party more than once. 2 days after that, coming home from the grocery store, she found the side door off the garage unlocked, though she was certain she'd locked it that morning, and a single drawer in Marcus's home office pulled open just enough to notice. Papers shifted, but nothing obviously missing. Nothing was taken. Nothing was broken. It was the kind of visit meant only to be noticed, a message dressed up as a coincidence, and it worked exactly as intended. When she finally told Marcus everything 3 days later, watching his face drain of color in real time, she understood that whatever restraint he'd used to carry this alone for 5 years had just run out completely. Marcus told her everything that night, the version of events he'd never given the original detectives because it would have implicated his own alibi statement, the one he'd signed without realizing what he was truly covering for. He described the scratch on Bragg's forearm that got explained away as a fence repair, the new set of tires that appeared on Bragg's truck 2 days after Camille went missing, the way Bragg's grief at the search parties had always played a beat too theatrical for a man who claimed he barely knew the missing woman. He talked about the friendship itself, 22 years running, the two of them starting the company out of a single pickup truck and a bank loan Marcus's own father had co-signed, and how impossible it had felt for 5 years to say the words out loud, "My best friend might be a killer," even to himself in the mirror some mornings. He told her about the first year after Camille disappeared, how he'd driven past the Michaels family's house more than once without stopping, unable to knock on a door and offer condolences to a family he suspected his own partner had shattered, unable to say anything at all without proof that might destroy two families and a company built from nothing in one sentence. He told her about the nights he'd lain awake, running the timeline over and over, certain of what his gut told him and terrified of being wrong, terrified of what it would mean for their own daughter, then 12 years old, to watch her father accuse a man who'd been at every birthday party she'd ever had. None of it was proof. All of it had sat in Marcus's chest for 5 years like a stone he couldn't put down, and now someone with a blocked number had confirmed, without meaning to, that Marcus had been right to keep digging. If a stranger called your house and told you to leave a 5-year-old grave undisturbed, would that be the moment you backed off? Or the moment you knew for certain you were finally close to the truth? That's exactly the fork Marcus and Denise stood at, and neither one of them chose to back off. Tell me below what you would have done with that phone still warm in your hand. They spent the next 11 days preparing for the trip differently than either of them had imagined they would. Marcus met with Willis twice more, going over old survey records of the coastline in detail. Denise, without telling her husband at first, drove 2 hours to a small town outside Fresno to meet Camille's older sister, a woman named Patrice, who still kept a framed photo of Camille on her mantle next to a candle that never seemed to go out. Patrice told Denise things the news articles never mentioned, that Camille had been planning to leave the company entirely once she told Bragg's wife the truth, that she'd talked about starting over somewhere new, that she'd called Patrice the night before she vanished sounding lighter than she had in months, like a woman who'd finally decided to stop being afraid. Patrice had always believed Bragg was responsible. She'd told the original detectives as much. Nobody had ever followed up. Denise came home from that visit with a folder of her own now, photographs Patrice had given her, a printed timeline, a promise that she'd call the moment there was any news. Patrice had shown her something else too, something she said she'd never given to the original detectives, because nobody had ever asked the right question. A journal half-filled that Camille had kept in the months before she disappeared, full of small entries about work, about a decision she was building toward, about being scared of a man she wouldn't name outright but described in enough detail that Denise recognized him instantly from the way Marcus had described him days earlier. Patrice had kept that journal in a shoebox for 5 years, unsure what it proved and unwilling to hand it to a police department that had already stopped returning her calls. She trusted Denise with it now, not because she knew her, but because she recognized in her the same look she'd worn herself for 5 years, the look of someone who wasn't going to let this go quietly. She didn't share all of it with Marcus right away. Some of it she carried alone for a few days, the way he had carried his own version of this same weight for 5 years, and for the first time she understood a little of what that kind of silence costs a person who's trying to protect the people they love from something they can't yet prove. When she finally handed him the journal, sitting together at their kitchen table long after their daughter had gone to bed, she watched her husband read pages written by a woman he'd worked alongside for 2 years, a woman whose fear had been documented in her own handwriting the entire time, sitting unread in a shoebox 2 counties away, while everyone who might have helped her moved on with their lives. They drove to Mendocino together 11 days later, Denise's name added to the reservation Marcus had booked to travel alone. The drive up the coast was quiet, in the way that only 2 people who've said everything already can be quiet together. Windows cracked, the smell of salt air getting stronger the closer they got. Willis met them near the coast the following morning with a folder of old survey records, showing a stretch of trail closed off 2 years after the original search. Collapsed cliffside terrain the county had fenced and mostly forgotten about. He'd also brought a handheld ground-penetrating device, borrowed from a contact still working county cases, the kind of tool that hadn't existed in general use 5 years earlier, when the original search teams combed these same trails with nothing but boots and cadaver dogs. It was Denise, walking half a step ahead on the muddy path, who noticed the disturbed earth near an old drainage culvert, soil that didn't match the erosion pattern bleeding down from the rest of the hillside. Willis ran the device slowly over the area, watching a small readout screen with an expression Denise had learned to read as careful, not certain. He moved the device in a wider grid pattern, marking the corners with small orange flags pulled from his jacket pocket, methodical in a way that told Denise this wasn't his first time doing this kind of quiet, careful work on a hillside that might hold someone's daughter. The fog hadn't lifted yet, and the three of them stood in a silence broken only by the sound of the ocean, somewhere below the cliff line, and the soft electronic tone of Willis's equipment passing back and forth over the same 6 feet of ground. He called Marcus over. Neither of them touched the ground. Willis, a man who'd built a career on knowing exactly which lines never to cross, called the county sheriff directly instead, giving coordinates and waiting on the fence line, rather than disturbing a single inch of soil that might matter later in a courtroom. Neither of them had let themselves imagine yet. They were still standing at the fence line when a truck pulled up on the access road behind them, and Theo Bragg stepped out wearing the same easy smile he'd worn at every company barbecue for 15 years. He said he'd been in the area for a supplier meeting and recognized Marcus's truck from the road, an explanation that landed with all the weight of a man who'd been following them since the state line. He asked what they were doing out past a closed trail marker, and for a long, cold moment nobody answered him. Denise felt Marcus's hand find hers, steady despite everything, and she understood that the next few minutes on that hillside would either end 19 years of marriage or finally close a 5-year-old wound neither of them had been able to name out loud until now. Bragg's tone shifted the moment he saw the marked-up survey map in Willis's hand, the easy company picnic warmth draining out of his voice like water through a crack. He asked, sharper now, who exactly had given them permission to dig around a county-restricted site, and Willis answered without blinking that the sheriff was already on the way. Something in Bragg's face changed then, a flicker Denise would describe to investigators weeks later as the look of a man doing fast arithmetic on how much time he had left. He tried a different approach next, softer, almost pleading, reminding Marcus that they'd known each other since they were 22 years old, hauling lumber together on someone else's job site before they'd ever had the nerve to start their own company. He talked about Marcus's father co-signing that first loan, about the years they'd spent building something neither of them could have built alone, and asked, voice cracking just slightly, whether all of that was really going to be thrown away over a mistake from someone else's past. Marcus didn't answer him with words at first. He took one step toward the culvert, and Bragg mirrored the movement, and for a moment the two men stood close enough that Denise found herself instinctively reaching for Willis's arm, unsure what either of them might do next on a hillside, with no one else around for half a mile. It was Marcus who finally spoke, his voice steady in a way that surprised even Denise, who'd spent 19 years learning every register of that voice. He said Camille's name out loud, calm and clear, the first time he'd ever said it directly to Bragg's face in 5 years, and asked him a single question. Did she know, at the end, that no one was coming for her? Bragg's easy smile finally cracked all the way through, and what replaced it wasn't anger so much as something closer to exhaustion. The look of a man who'd spent 5 years performing a version of himself he no longer had the energy to keep playing. The sheriff's deputies arrived 9 minutes later, the longest 9 minutes of Denise's life, during which Bragg alternated between friendly denial and a kind of quiet, controlled fury she'd never seen from him in 15 years of holiday parties and job site visits. He left before the excavation team even finished setting up their equipment, telling Marcus this wasn't over in a voice too calm to be anything but a threat, and drove off in the same truck that had trailed them from the state line. What the recovery team pulled from beneath that culvert over the following 2 days finally gave the Michaels family an answer they'd waited 5 years for, and gave detectives enough physical evidence combined with the timeline gaps Marcus had never reported, to reopen the case with Theo Bragg named as the primary suspect within the week. Bragg was arrested 11 days after Denise and Marcus flew home, apprehended at a private airfield 2 counties over, with a packed bag and a one-way charter already fueled. News of the arrest moved through Sacramento's construction community within hours, and by the following week, Carter Construction's phones were ringing with calls from clients wanting reassurance, from reporters wanting quotes, from old colleagues who claimed they'd always sensed something off about Bragg and had simply never said it out loud. Marcus stopped answering most of them. Denise fielded the ones that mattered, protecting her husband through a version of the same instinct he'd used to protect her for 5 years. Except now they were finally doing it together instead of apart. The case that followed made regional news for months, built on cell tower records placing Bragg near the trailhead the afternoon Camille disappeared. A cash withdrawal 3 days later that matched the cost of a tire replacement paid in full. The physical evidence recovered from the hillside that no defense attorney could argue around, and, in the end, Camille's own journal entered into evidence as prosecutors built a timeline of escalating fear in her final weeks that lined up precisely with the dates Bragg's alibi claimed he'd been elsewhere. The trial itself stretched across 8 weeks the following spring, and Marcus was called to testify about the alibi he'd unknowingly provided all those years ago. A moment Denise watched from the second row of the gallery holding Patrice's hand, both of them finally in the same room after everything that had led them there. She watched her husband's voice hold steady through an hour of cross-examination designed to rattle him, and she understood, watching him, that whatever guilt he'd carried for 5 years had finally found somewhere useful to go. Bragg was convicted on all counts, and the sentencing hearing drew a courtroom full of people who'd known Camille only through news photographs, finally putting a face to 5 years of silence. Patrice spoke at that hearing, reading from the journal herself, her voice steady in a way that made the whole room go still. Carter Construction severed its ownership stake from the Bragg family entirely within the quarter that followed, rebuilding under Marcus's name alone with a leaner crew and, for the first time in 5 years, a foreman he didn't have to watch out of the corner of his eye. Marcus finally sat his daughter down and told her the real reason he'd seemed distant through so much of her teenage years. A 5-year wait he'd been carrying alone to keep his family safe from a truth he couldn't yet prove. She cried, and then she hugged him longer than she had in years, and told him she wished he'd trusted her enough to let her carry some of it too. Denise found that the marriage she'd nearly convinced herself was collapsing under the weight of a hidden affair had, in the end, only grown stronger under the weight of a secret Marcus never should have carried by himself. She and Patrice stayed close in the years that followed, meeting for coffee every few months, a friendship built out of the worst circumstances either of them could have imagined, and somehow worth keeping anyway. They kept the anniversary trip on the calendar the following year, same lodge, same week in October, but this time there was no folder hidden on a laptop, and no name Denise had to search for at 3 in the morning with her husband asleep beside her. Just 2 names on one reservation, the way it always should have been, and a coastline that finally belonged to nothing but the 2 of them. If this kind of story pulled you in, stay close, because the next one hits just as hard, and you won't want to miss where it goes. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next.